The Texas Parks and Wildlife television series is funded in part by a grant from the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. Through your purchases of hunting and fishing equipment and motorboat fuels, over $50 million in conservation efforts are funded in Texas each year. Additional support provided by Ram Trucks, built to serve. Coming up on Texas Parks and Wildlife.
We documented about 500 plant species from the ranch. That's a lot of species.
Even if you can get a person with a disability up in a blind, it's going to be almost impossible for them to move around. There she is.
We're looking at reintroducing Texas horned lizards onto areas where they once existed, but now they're gone.
Texas Parks and Wildlife, a television series for all outdoors.
I'm Chris Harte. I live downtown and don't own a car in Austin anymore.
Chris Harte lives in the urban heart of Central Texas.
Austin always has been growing.
But since the early 1970s, the Harte family has kept a quiet escape just 30 miles west.
There are little places here and there around the ranch that I just always love to go to because they're peaceful or different in some way. The creek down in the limestone canyons, you can get totally away. The development has come out from Austin. It's accelerated a lot in the last 10 or 15 years.
But the Harte's Spicewood Ranch has been growing in a different way.
We bought 280 acres in 1972 from a wonderful gentleman, Dayton McGinnis. And then just over time, we've defragmented. We've created a 1,300 acre piece of land out of 35 or 40 different pieces of land. I married Kay Wagenick back in 1984, and she, over the next few years, convinced me that we ought to be restoring this place.
If you had a really good grassland, the cows would be a really important part of it, like the buffalo were. But we don't have that. We are trying to reset that habitat, and that's why the cows aren't here. There's literally hundreds of them in here.
Kay and David had worked on a project together.
All through here. These are all Engelmann daisies. 30 years ago, this ranch was very typical of most of the hill country. Most of the edible plants, either for grazing or browsing, were either greatly reduced or gone entirely. Our goal was to put back the grasses. Also, though, we want to put back the flowers, the perennial forbs, but even harder were the woody plants.
Fire is a very important part of the process. I think the first year we did a burn, we just burned right around the house here. The fire improves the chances of the natives succeeding and knocks back most of the cedar, the cactus, the things that have expanded because of overgrazing, helps reduce those.
Chris brought our family out in 1972 as part of the deer lease.
Alan has been here literally from the beginning. He was only 14.
We hunted on it for years, and that kind of evolved to more of a wildlife manager. I've seen it change over the years, and that's what's been remarkable, just to see the progress that it's made from cedar, mesquite covered to now grass savannas, brush habitat, lots of forbs, flowers, everything coming back.
That plant diversity actually can lead to more wildlife diversity.
Animals need habitat and they'll come back.
It's a build it, they will come.
Our goal with the high fence is restoration.
The Spicewood Ranch actually uses the high fence to keep deer out. They're concentrated on the habitat, and they control their deer numbers to keep them low.
It's actually been a really good year this year to get the numbers down.
They're in the Managed Land Deer Permit program.
They're getting what they need to eat, and they're getting better food to burn the south field up into
When we
the
started,
middle section.
there were no post oaks younger than, say, 50 or 75 years. No young is a dying forest. We have high fenced one of those areas and got the deer numbers down to almost none. And lo and behold, we're getting post oak seedlings.
They've been basically managing for plant diversity here for a long time. We documented about 500 plant species from the ranch, that's a lot of species. The common name is netleaf bundleflower. It's endemic to Texas. The outreach component of what Chris is doing is really exciting to me.
Let's go this way.
He started to have plant classes.
These cliffs provide refuge for plants when there's too many deer and goats. So these are clues that these used to be here. Chris's expansion of the ranch causes one problem. There's a lot more work to be done.
Well, it's only going to get better. Chris is always working.
Just to see the long process of the work paying off has been a real joy. I think Kay would be ecstatic with the transformation on the ranch. When she passed away, Chris picked it up and took it to a new level.
Chris and her son Will had no questions that they wanted to continue this, and we just haven't slowed down.
I'm glad we did it, not just because of who Kay was and her legacy. It's been fun.
Elias Brown is going on his first hunt. He and his dad are in a special hunting blind adapted for people with disabilities. Like most hunts, there's a lot of watching and waiting. But there's space for people with special needs to move comfortably.
My son has a prosthetic leg, so it's more accessible to get into it. Even if you can get a person with a disability up in a blind, a traditional blind, it's going to be almost impossible for him to move around. So these things are 8 foot by 8 foot with plenty of headspace.
They're taking part in a first-of-its-kind hunt at Inks Lake State Park, northwest of Austin. The park has built 4 of these accessible blinds in a hunting area away from the campgrounds.
We have done some research and custom built 4 hunting blinds, full 8 by 8.
It looks comfortable. Is it comfortable? Yeah.
We have dropped the windows down to access the height and level of the wheelchair. The carpet is not skid surface, very good noise dampener. The hunt's been great.
I got in a wheelchair because a drunk driver hit me when I was 18 years old. When I was in the stand, I actually moved around and kind of, shifted my position some. The stand didn't creak or anything. It was just perfectly solid. The stands were fantastic, and the help here was fantastic. I can't say anything bad about anything.
Just think, next time we have lasagna.
For Elias, the wait paid off as he bagged his very first deer.
He was extremely excited. I said, you'll remember this for the rest of your life.
That's what happened.
As hunters exchanged stories, park staff and volunteers helped process the deer.
Were you shaking?
No. Well, yeah. It was my first hunting trip, first shot, and he dropped, so that was great. Okay, I'll go 111.
And it's really important for me to have a good relationship with him. But yeah, we're really close.
Texas Parks and Wildlife offers a wide variety of public hunting opportunities. Inks Lake State Park is already planning the next mentored hunt for people with disabilities.
With the increased popularity, the success of this year already, don't know exact numbers, but I can assure you we're going to start constructing a few more.
Maybe next year, Elias can show his sister the ropes.
I have a daughter in a wheelchair, and she could easily get there with me and her brother or mom.
Good job, buddy.
It just opens up worlds.
Malcolm Cleveland. Well, he is part researcher, part historian, and part climate detective is probably a good way to put it.
Beautiful trees. We're studying the bald cypress trees because we're interested in getting the information about climate out of the tree rings. The bald cypress, although they do grow right in the water or right next to the water, they actually show the influence of climate. The center is right here. If it's a good growing year, they put on a nice ring, and in a drought, they'll put on a much smaller ring.
Trees like these, along the San Bernard River west of Houston, have been keeping climate records much longer than people have.
Right now we've got a chronology here that goes back to the 1400s. I'm convinced that many of these trees started growing before Europeans came to the New World.
The quest for such long-term data has Malcolm Cleveland seeking out the oldest cypress trees in south central Texas. His research is being funded by the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority.
We manage a river that is spring dependent. And that's unusual in Texas. The Guadalupe River is dependent on the two major Edwards Aquifer springs. We're in a drought right now, and 80% of the water in the river is coming out of those two springs. And so it's important for us to know what types of droughts we have to contend with in the future, and we're trying to figure that out by seeing what kinds of droughts have impacted our region over the past.
We don't have a good record for central Texas yet. Main thing is that bald cypress get old. The bald cypress have the potential of going back at least 700 or 800 years. I'm sure we'll get 400 to 500 years out of this site, and they say that there are older trees downstream. Certainly there are bigger trees downstream. Whether they're older, I don't know, but we'll sure find out.
You ready?
Yep.
Oh, you gotta warn me when you're doing that.
Well, I didn't know I was going to do it myself.
With a research assistant, Malcolm hits the water. Finding the oldest cypress trees requires a boat.
There we go.
And finding the best specimens takes some hunting.
That guy's probably old, but look at him, he's hollow.
Up and down the river, they examine trees.
This is a beautiful little river.
To the point of distraction.
Get too wrapped up in looking at the trees.
Unfortunately, at this site, the oldest cypress seemed to have one thing in common.
Yeah, he's hollow.
Rot.
That is very discouraging. If all these trees here were solid, I'm convinced that we would have a 700-year record of drought, maybe longer.
But the San Bernard River is just one site being surveyed for this climate study.
It's like a treasure hunt. I've visited, I guess, maybe a dozen sites now, state parks, you know, all sorts of places that we have gone where there are bald cypress, and then you have to sample them and see how old they are. You just can't tell by how large bald cypress is how old it is, and so that makes it even more difficult.
Back at the University of Arkansas, the cores are transformed into tree ring timelines.
When we get back in the lab, we mount the samples, and then we sand it very carefully so that you can see every little detail of the core.
Tree ring dating, or dendrochronology, is possible because trees generally form a new ring each year. Wet years grow wide rings, dry years are narrow. Over many years, the wide and narrow patterns are unique snapshots of the climate and can be cross-dated to other trees from the area.
Well, cross-dating is the way in which we ensure that the chronology is exact. You need to match the patterns of wide and narrow rings in many trees and between many sites to make sure that your chronology is correct. The problem is most of these trees have heart rot. And so if it's 12 inches in diameter and you only got 4 inches out of it, who knows what you missed in the heart rot zone.
Hit a rot pocket.
Too bad.
In an attempt to bypass rot, scientists may take multiple cores. Fortunately, sampling does not harm these trees.
The long-lived trees like oak and bald cypress have developed strategies for coping with wounding.
I think it'll have turned by
They don't live 1,000 years or even 300 years if they can't cope with wounds. And so they'll seal off. You come back in September and look for the holes where we took out our little sample, and you won't be able to see it because it will have grown over.
Ultimately, some 750 tree ring samples are taken to reveal a long-term history of rainfall and the lack of it.
Water planning is based on the worst drought for which you have detailed records, and that's the drought of the 50s, the statewide drought from 1950 to 1957, but parts of Texas actually were in that drought from probably 42, 43 to 57. So there are some that think, you know, that drought's an aberration, probably won't have another drought like that for 1,000 years or so. And we're finding with these tree ring studies that it's actually a regularly occurring event and happens about every 50 to 100 years. And sometimes it's much worse than it was during the 50s.
There have been some really bad droughts in the past. Droughts that make, the 1950s drought look like a wet period. If your climate records only go back to the 1850s, that doesn't tell you anything about what the worst possible drought is. You really need these records from tree rings to tell us, so we plan to go to the Texas Water Conservation Association and show them.
Next presentation, we've got two speakers. Gentlemen.
Here is the long-term reconstruction from 1500.
There's at least one really bad drought per century.
Bad drought period here, the 1700s and the early 1800s look a lot worse.
It would be worse because the population has grown.
Now we know a lot more about drought than we did. One of the messages today was maybe we ought to think about how we would cope with one of these more severe droughts that occurred in the past. We planned for a 10-year drought, but what do we do year 11?
There are signs that the climate is changing, and it's not changing for the better. It's going to make life a lot harder. And I know in Texas now, there are ranchers that have had to sell off their herds, and it's a terrible hardship. And if that becomes the new climatology, we're in really serious trouble. Some say the drought of the 1950s was a 1 in 1,000 year event. Well, that's not true. On the other hand, if you say, well, the drought of the 1950s was bad, but we know that there are worse droughts in the past, then you can make some planning. We're trying to illuminate some of these forgotten chapters of history.
That history cannot reveal exactly when the next drought will come, or just how bad it may be. But we can be better prepared for future droughts because of scientists like Malcolm Cleveland, these grand old trees, and what they can tell us about the past.
Well, this guy might be pretty old.
That one?
Yep. All right.
We're at the Muse Wildlife Management Area, and this is the site that we've chosen to evaluate the feasibility and the success of a translocation of wild-caught Texas horned lizards.
Go ahead and grab the next one here.
We're looking at reintroducing Texas horned lizards onto areas where they once existed, but now they're gone. We've had a lot of interest over the years in reintroducing lizards to properties, and we've never really looked at the feasibility of even doing that. Will they survive? Where do they go? What will happen? So we're trying to just see if it's possible.
Okay, let's get the weight on this lizard.
64.
These horned lizards were collected from roadsides on private properties southwest of San Angelo. Okay, good.
Several private ranchers donated and want to be a part of this project.
The lizards go into that predator-proof enclosure so they can acclimate first. We call that a soft release.
We've done quite a bit of brush work out here to make the habitat more suitable for lizards, but they need a somewhat sandy type soils. They need a good supply of harvester ants. That's the primary diet of horned lizards.
They were evaluated, and then we brought them on site, and we put what we call a pit tag inside each lizard to help identify that animal. 735 AFF3. Okay, good. We then affixed them with a VHF radio transmitter to track them to get daily locations on each lizard. The frequency for this transmitter is going to be 150.631. Okay, I think that's her right there. This is Tester's model paint. We paint them with a little bit of model paint, and that just helps them to blend into the natural environment here. They're actually glued onto the back using a non-toxic eyelash glue that's used in the cosmetic industry. And then we use a collar, which is simply tubing with a fishing line run through it. So far, it's working excellent. All right. They spend about 10 days in that enclosure. At this point, we let them disperse on their own and we begin our daily tracking. Every day we get these locations, and the first thing we were interested in is dispersal away from the enclosure site, or simply how far are they moving out. She hasn't moved very far lately. Great. Okay, we're getting closer. Yep, there she is. Go ahead and get her GPS location. Okay, you got that?
Yes, sir.
Later in the day, I come in and I plug that into the computer, and we can already start looking at habitat use. These horned lizards use lots of different types of habitat. We have had some predation. It's always sad to lose another horned lizard, but it's a learning opportunity for us to see what's harmful to them. And as we learn more about what's killing these lizards, we'll try to avoid that in future releases. We know lizards were here at one time.
There she is.
Everybody grew up with them, so it's kind of an iconic animal they grew up with, and now they're not there. People, really want to know why we can't bring them back.
25.8.
There have been very few research studies dealing with Texas horned lizards, learning about their habitat use and really what they need in the wild.
Horned lizard habitat is good quail habitat, and it's good turkey habitat, and generally good deer habitat. So it's another way to educate people on the importance of just good habitat management.
This way.
Probably it'll be several years down the road before we really know what's going to happen here, but we're very optimistic.
We've actually seen weekly increases in body weight for both males and females. It's an indicator to us that they're finding enough to eat, so that's very important for us.
We'd like to really restore these lizards back to much of the state where they're gone. That's kind of our ultimate goal.
This series is funded in part by a grant from the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. Through your purchases of hunting and fishing equipment and motorboat fuels, over $50 million in conservation efforts are funded in Texas each year. Additional support provided by Ram Trucks, built to serve.